Thank you. That's a tough introduction to follow. When Tom Repke called and asked me to talk about the domestic policy prospects for 1994, I was reminded once again that there have really been some powerful, dramatic changes that have taken place during the last 10 years or so. I think if this lecture series had been held a dozen years ago, say back in the spring of 1982, one of the major themes would have been the economy. And many of us have now forgotten, and I think there's some out here that never knew, the terrible economic mess this country was in such a short time ago. Hard to believe we were in a deep recession, jobs being lost, stock market stagnant, and both interest rates and the rate of inflation climbing close to a scary 20%. There were people then who were fearful of either losing their jobs or having to cope with hyperinflation or both. And that fear is now gone. One of the great legacies of the 1980s is that our economy, despite its imperfections, and despite the damage that has been done to it in recent years by both the Bush and the Clinton administrations, is far and away the most powerful and prosperous economy in the world today. Then again, if this lecture had been held, say, just 10 years ago, one of the major themes would have been the threat of an all-out nuclear war with the Soviet Union. A nuclear Armageddon with a scale of horror almost impossible to imagine. That fear is gone now. One of the greatest legacies of the 1980s, culminating with the signing of the first nuclear arms reduction treaty in 1987, was the elimination of any threat of an all-out nuclear war between the two great superpowers. Now, it's true the nuclear devil has not gone away, and continuing proliferation of nuclear weapons in many countries, smaller countries, is of grave concern. But today, the United States is far and away the most militarily powerful nation on this earth. Its national security not seriously threatened for the first time in many decades. And then again, if this lecture had been held in the early 1980s, one of its themes probably would have been the threat of the spread of communism and how that evil system was ruining the lives of so many people, grinding them into poverty, ruining their environments, denying them basic human rights, and then killing and maiming them in ideological wars. And that fear is gone now, too. The dark clouds of communism have lifted. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the 1980s was the defeat of the communist idea. The philosophy of communism is now utterly bankrupt, dismissed everywhere in the world, say perhaps for the faculties of a few elite universities. Dismissed as an idea that did not work, an idea that caused more misery for more people than any idea in history. And today, the political system that did battle with the communist idea for 70 years or so, American capitalism, stands triumphant. And it's the political and moral model of virtually every nation in the world. So today, it's only natural, with the communist threat faded, the threat of nuclear war gone, and the threat of economic disaster vanished, that the American people should turn their political attentions to other issues. And that's exactly what's happening. Issues as crime, welfare, and health care, while always important, have now risen to the top of the national priority list. So I think if we look ahead to the rest of this year, there are three domestic policy issues that will probably dominate the national political scene. Health care reforms, welfare reform, and the whole question of crime. So first, let's take a look at the prospects for radical health care reform. There's probably no more important issue or bigger issue in terms of domestic policy than the radical health care plan that President Clinton has proposed. It affects 1/7 of our economy and is deeply would affect the lives of every American. And the changes and the likely consequences of these changes are fiendishly complicated. And since it was unveiled a few months ago, thousands of experts have been looking at it, and we're just beginning to understand the full dimensions of this plan. First of all, I was going to bring a copy of the bill here, but I couldn't get it on the airplane. It's actually only 1,342 pages. I measured it last night. It's 2 inches thick. The interesting thing about that, how many of you have read it? You can ask the same question of your congressman, and you'd get the same answer. And a number of experts have been slowly pouring through it. I have yet to meet a single person who's read the entire thing, and yet they want us to vote on this. Now, one of the things that's happened in literally the last 3 or 4 weeks, have been a series of events that I will argue have changed the entire prospects for the Clinton health care package. And I think the turning point came back in January. An old associate of mine, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, now a senator from New York. I think he likes to forget he used to once work in the Richard Nixon White House. But he's a smart old fox. And a fellow I've never known to stay on a sinking ship. And he came out, he's the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and has an enormous amount to say about what happens to the Clinton health care package. And he came out recently and said flatly, there's no health care crisis in America. Well, it just cuts the legs off under the plan, because the whole plan is premised on the fact that there is an enormous health care crisis. We need to do something radical. And while that was sinking in, a colleague of mine at Stanford University, Elaine Enthoven, who is is probably known as the godfather of the whole question of managed care, health care, managed competition in health care, and probably has a reputation of being, the top expert in the country on this kind of mega plan, and was involved in the initial designing of Clinton's health care package. He came out and said, first of all, that Clinton was turning this into socialized medicine. It would involve enormous increases in taxes. And finally, it wouldn't work. And then, same week, 562 economists signed a letter, which I was one of those signed it, sent a letter to President Clinton. I never did acknowledge it. But we said, price controls don't work either. All you have to do is look throughout history. And if you put price controls on health care, you're just going to make things a lot worse. And then while that was sinking in, the Congressional Budget Office, much to the dismay of the White House, began to display a little independence and integrity. And said they had done the calculations, and, this plan was going to cost $130 billion more than Mr. Clinton had said it would. And there would be a need for massive tax increases. And then while all that was going on, the Labor Department, headed by Bob Reich, put out some numbers. And he said, if you look at what's been going on in the cost of health care, strange things happened the last 3 years. The rate of increase is going down. It was about 8% back in 91, and then in 1992 it dropped down at a little under 7%, and last year it was only 5.4%. Gee, the crisis that doesn't exist is getting less worse. And I think the interesting question is, why are these people saying these things? The people who know the most about this plan are the ones that seem to have the most trepidation about it, with the exception of President Clinton and his family. Let me go through just a few of what I think are the key problems with the plan, some of which have been discussed and some of which haven't. One, people are finally beginning to realize that there was a brilliant article by Senator Graham in a recent issue of the Wall Street Journal, which simply cites the bill and points out very clearly that no matter what they say, the language of the bill is going to take away your choice of doctors. They are going to wipe up the current health care plans. The alliances are going to determine what health care plans are available. You will have a choice of one of their plans, and they will run it. Then there's the whole question of waiting lines. Every now and then someone points to Canada as a wonderful example of a health care system. What they don't do is tell you about the waiting lines. One of the characteristics of government, I think there are two interesting examples. If you just think back to the last time you were at the post office, I'm sure you didn't have to wait in line. Or the last time you went down to the Department of Motor Vehicles to get your license renewed. Now, I don't know what it's like in Ohio, but I know in California, you better spend at least a half hour, an hour if you're going to do that. And this is what government does. When they have something and they're running short of it, they don't raise the price, they ration it. The easiest way to ration it, they make you wait in line. Canada now, there's a recent study done by the Hoover Institution. The average waiting time for non-elective surgery, which means if you're not in the emergency room but you've got some serious problems, is well over 3 months. In cases of some kinds of surgery, some kinds of medical attention, it can easily run up to a year and a half. The most interesting part of this survey is they did a terrible thing. They asked the people who were waiting in line if they were experiencing any pain. 45% said, yeah, they were experiencing pain. Then there's one other part of this plan, which you may or may not have seen much attention paid to. Remember when President Clinton held up on national television the health care card and said, hey, you have one of these little fellas and health care for life? Well, it's got a few other implications to it, too. For his plan to work, you're going to have to carry one of these. And what they're talking about is a national identity card. It doesn't work without it. Ira Magaziner, the chief health guy in the White House, has said, we intend to issue these at birth. Now, what they intend to put on them is your entire health record, for starters. This is an actual card. I called up the company that's making them and trying to sell them. This one's made by Drexler Technology. It's called a laser card. Exactly the same size and shape as a credit card. Pretty cheap. In quantity, you can produce them for $2 or $3 a piece. That card, when you put it in what they call a reading machine, the information comes up on the big screen. First thing they can put in there with digitalized information is a face photo. Then they can put in your fingerprints. Then they can put in your voice. And they still have room left over for 1,600 pages of information. Now, I don't know about you, but that's more than enough for the things I've done. What they intend to put in there, every time you go to a drugstore, all the prescriptions will be put in. Every time you go to a doctor, all the treatments put in. Every time you go to a hospital, all the treatments put in. And it's there forever, because you can't erase these little cards. Now, this has some interesting implications. Little question of privacy here. There may be some people who have had certain medical conditions that rather other people didn't know about. Not to worry, says the Clinton administration. The cards will only be seen by authorized people. Which is what bothers me. For example, if you had an abortion, it's on the card. If you ever tested positive for venereal disease, it's on the card. If you had hemorrhoids, it's on the card. If you test positive for HIV, it's on the card. Other little problems. What happens if you lose the card? There's only one way to solve that problem, and that's whenever you put the card in the machine, they've got to make a duplicate record. And they've also announced one of the great things about this kind of a system is you can tie all the machines in all the various offices throughout the country into one central computer computer bank, and there are some doctors that are salivating at the prospect of doing real-time analysis. You can watch diseases spread. You can do all kinds of wonderful things. And there are other people who are just waiting for the card because then you can put your Social Security number on it. There are some people who think we should use it as a passport. Other people say, ha, now we know how to control those illegal aliens. And then there are other people who say, well, we can use it to check into a hotel room. And so far the IRS hasn't thought of it, but hey, this was an old one, 1,600 pages. I think the latest one is up to over 2,000 pages. We can get your financial records on this, too. And then, if you really wanted to be perverse, seeing as it's now considered a health issue, I guess we just have to register all the guns on there, too. But anyways, there is no limit to the possibility. Technology has outraced most people's imagination as to what can be done. Then, what I think is the most telling point against the Clinton health plan is that they have very carefully exempted all federal employees from it. Congressmen don't come under it. Senators don't come under it. The president doesn't come under it. Hillary doesn't come under it. So, just the rest of us to get to use it. And I think the answer here is that if they're really serious about health prospects and they think it's such a good plan, maybe they ought to set up a pilot program for federal bureaucrats first. Let them try it. Anyways, we can go on and on about this, but let me just sum up. I think that the more the American people have found out about this, exactly how it works, the tide has turned, and I would predict as of this morning, the Clinton health plan is dead. As is. There are some other prospects for other health plans rolling along right behind it, which we can talk about those later. Let me just say a few words about welfare reform, because this is going to be another big issue. It's almost a perennial issue. Every few years, somebody gets the idea, well, let's fix the welfare system. And instead of studying it and taking a careful look at what's really wrong with the welfare system, they come up with all these brand new, bold new ideas. For example, we've got 2 years and you're out. That sounds appealing. But if you ask them questions, what are they talking about? They say, well, you know, after you've been on welfare for 2 years, and if you can work, you got to go to work. And I don't know, maybe I'm just got a perverse view of this, but my question is, hey, if you can work, why are they on welfare in the first place? Why are we waiting 2 years? And haven't yet got an answer to that one. Oh, there are proposals on the board. There are some people who say that one of the problems with people on welfare is they don't have enough assets. That's why they're on welfare, you know, and proposals to increase the asset limitation up to as much as $10,000, which would only make it possible for more and more people to get on welfare. I think that this is an issue which is going to be even more troublesome than health care, because they're probably going to try to do something about it. And the Republicans are equally devoid of what is wrong and what should be done as the Democrats on this one. And I'd like to suggest this morning that there are two things that are wrong with the welfare system that if we fixed them would eliminate almost the entire problem. Very few Americans have a problem with people who cannot take care of themselves getting welfare, even in a generous way. But what drives them crazy is people who can take care of themselves, who are ripping the system off and who are cheating. And if you look at the welfare system, every time anyone does a study of welfare, they come up with extraordinary percentages of outright fraud, stealing. Never seen a study come up with less than 20-25%. Had one done a couple of months ago down in San Diego with and they actually identified 213 cases, and they examined each case very carefully. And they found there that the rate of fraud was 62%. There are situations where there are people on welfare who shouldn't be on welfare. For example, the SSI program, which was developed to provide aid to the disabled and the aged. Well, the bureaucrats fixed that one. They classified as disabled heroin addicts, cocaine addicts, alcoholics. And guess what? Now they get 250,000 cocaine and heroin addicts and alcoholics getting huge monthly checks. Give you an example. Out in San Francisco was the front page story the other day. I forget the fellow's name now. This guy's a amphetamine addict, speed addict. He'd get his check for $603 or something like that at the beginning of the month. Take the money, go down on the street, buy himself an ounce of amphetamine. Take it home, cut it up in 100 little bags, go back down the street, sell them out for $2,000. Then he would go pay the rent on his $1,400 a month nice apartment in San Francisco and have the rest of the money left to finish off the month. Said it was a hell of a deal. But I'm serious. When you have a policy that you know people are cheating, you don't do anything about it, when you classify alcoholics and known drug addicts, in fact, there was one guy who was convicted of being a heroin dealer, and they said, well, you know, I'm still entitled to his check because he's disabled. And, all right, the second thing in welfare reform that people are starting to look at is ask the question of, why are these people on welfare? 99% of what you read about welfare will be about, well, isn't it terrible what these women are doing having all these children? Did you ever see an article that talks about the guy? And what is the real problem here of the so-called deadbeat dads? Virtually 80% of the payments that have been decreed by the courts are not being made these days for child support. Every time one father walks out and deserts his or her his family, you put one mother and one kid, and maybe two kids, and maybe three kids on welfare. And that's why most of them are there. They're putting a few of these fellas in jail, seriously, quickly, and the word would spread. Believe me. If you did those two things, if you stop putting people on welfare who shouldn't, because the parents will not pay financial support, and if you prevented people from cheating the system, I think you would find the welfare rolls would shrink dramatically, the cost would shrink dramatically, and the stigma on welfare would go away. Third and last issue is crime. And here again, you know, both parties are against crime. But one of the things they haven't pointed out is that one of the legacies of the 1980s is that most rates of crime went down drastically. It is true that violent crime increased slightly, not an awful lot, but a tremendous amount of attention has been paid to it. And unfortunately, here again, instead of going back and looking at what does work, and what does work, you increase the odds of being caught, you increase the odds of being convicted, you speed up trials, and most importantly, you keep criminals in jail for what they were sentenced for. I gave a talk down here recently in North Carolina last month, and I'm just curious, it was at a think tank, and I said, by the way, I said, what's the average length of time that people in North Carolina serve? It's a pretty tough state. And they said 20%. Now, if you really want to do something about crime, the only thing we've ever shown that has been shown that works, there's some fascinating work done this by, for example, James Q. Wilson. Rehabilitation doesn't work. No more than government job training programs produce trained workers. What works is a violent criminal is taken off the streets and you keep him in jail. And while he or she is in jail, they don't commit any crimes outside. And the other thing that works is aging. The older they get, the less violent they get. Some of you have probably noticed that. Unfortunately, there are a number of solutions being presented, which I call the feel-good reforms. We just had one went into effect today, the Brady Bill. They said, gee, now if a criminal wants a pistol, he has to wait 5 days. Hey, in California, we've been waiting 15 days for a number of years now and hadn't slowed down anybody. And this is the kind of symbolic things that not only don't do any good, but I think actually make things worse, because they give people a false impression that we're doing something. Another one is 3 strikes and you're out. We're going to change the federal law. I haven't done the study on this, but someone has pointed out that, you know, that might involve as many as 30 or 40 prisoners a year. Then there's this whole new idea of boot camps. I looked into that one. We've had boot camps in the United States now for about 10 years. Now we take young, this is one of Clinton's favorite ideas. We got about 50 of those camps now. I've had them for about 10 years. And someone did a terrible thing, they went back and studied them and said, well, how do they work? Well, how they work is the following. They cost more than prison. The recidivism rate is just about as high. In other words, it's a waste of time. What they do, however, they encourage judges to take young first-time offenders and people who would not be sent to prison, They say, well, let's put them in boot camp and kick them around for a few months. Do them good. Wrong, because 50 to 60% of them never make it through boot camp, and they automatically go to prison, and the net result has been we've increased the prison population. So that one doesn't work. So whether it's welfare or whether it's crime, I think if we went back to basics, we could make some progress here. Now, I'd just like to take a few minutes at the end here because this may be a little heresy here, but I think there's also a possibility in 1994 that these big, powerful domestic issues, health care, welfare, and crime, may be overtaken and usurped by another domestic issue. One we've had some experience with in the past, but it's new for this administration. That's called scandal. And we've all been reading a little bit about Whitewater. Actually, there are 3 scandals. You get the Whitewater scandal, you get the Troopergate scandal, and you get the Vincent Foster scandal. And they're all interrelated. And let me just quickly go through them. Whitewater is a scandal dealing with financial improprieties. The reason it's a problem is because the President of the United States is alleged to have committed certain financial dealings which may be illegal. In fact, a lot of stuff in the press is talking about question about not doing one's taxes properly. That's a real problem. The second scandal is called Troopergate. Probably haven't read about much about that in the press, but it's been in some of the publications. LA Times had a big story on it, American Spectator, in which 4 Arkansas state troopers have alleged that William Jefferson Clinton, while governor of Arkansas, engaged in activities, and we're not talking about his sexual proclivities, we're talking about what is alleged to be world-class sexual harassment. We're talking about the use of government property, we're talking about the intimidation of people, things which are against the law. And finally, the tragic death of a White House aide back in last July has never gone away. I don't know if you recall this, but a fellow named Vincent Foster. The reason I'm particularly concerned about this one, he had his office up on the 2nd floor of the west wing of the White House. And I remember it was only about 40, 50 feet down the hall from where I had my office. And when a high-ranking White House aide is found in a park with a bullet in the head, it sends a chill down through all former White House aides. Because it's never happened before. It's the first time in history. And now at the time, there was a brief investigation. Curiously, the FBI wasn't called in. The investigation of his death was left to the park police on the grounds that he had been found in a little unknown, small, obscure park called Fort Marcy. And the park police, who if they're not chasing squirrels, I guess are, patrolling the park, quickly concluded that he had indeed committed suicide. And there it is sat, although some people raised some questions at the time. In recent weeks, there's been a lot more attention being paid to it. And in particular, there was a series of articles in the New York Post where a reporter went out and 6 months after the fact interviewed some of the people who discovered the body. And what they are coming up with is certain kinds of evidence which clearly point away from committing suicide. For example, they said the body was lying perfectly flat, straight, nice and neat. They said they couldn't see any blood. One of them said he couldn't even see an exit wound. The gun was held firmly in the hand, although most forensic experts say that, if you stick a .38 caliber pistol in your mouth and pull the trigger, it has large recoil, and the gun usually flies. Those are the kinds of questions that have created a lot of inquiry that is now proceeding. And what we have on the horizon, we now have a special prosecutor investigating criminal wrongdoing of the President of the United States, named Fisk, setting up an office down in Little Rock. He has just set up yesterday an office in Washington, D.C. The The person he put in charge of that office, and by the way, one of the things they're looking into is all the events surrounding the death of Vincent Foster. And the guy he put in charge of his Washington office is a former New York prosecutor. He used to work with Frank Hogan and Morgenthau, and for 6 years was an expert in homicides. Now, nothing may come out of this, but then again, I have gone through 2 nice scandals in my time, Watergate and Iran-Contra. And the one thing that's characteristic of all of these scandals is that early on, there's an allegation of illegal activity, there's a flat denial, and then there are all kinds of mysterious things start to happen. And I don't know where it's going, but if that happens, then forget about health care reform, forget about welfare reform, forget about that kind of crime control, and we may be in for a very disturbing year. Thank you.